So my old title for this piece, Treachery on Both Sides, Mark Twain's Lessons to Modern America on White Victimhood, plays on Trump's very fine people on both sides statements. But for reasons I'll explain soon, I've updated the title. Let's sneak over. So the new title, The Dangers of White Victimhood, What Twain Can Teach Us About the January 6th Insurrection. When I heard about the topic of this conference, growth, and read some of the guiding questions, the one that immediately stuck out to me was, how can the study of Mark Twain and his era help scholars and students understand systemic racism? I've been working on a project centered around Twain and white victimhood for quite some time, because I believe you cannot understand America's current racial climate without understanding white victimhood. But the question many of my students wonder, why, when so many modern authors have taken up this subject, do I still think it's vital that my students read Twain in particular to understand our current cultural upheaval? Well, I boiled it down to two reasons, although there might be more. Reason number one, Twain epitomizes personal growth pertaining to race. The racist views of young Samuel Clemens have been expounded on by numerous critics, but I always return to this particular letter, you see, because here we see one of the main frames of victimhood on display. The idea of better treatment, of whites being left behind, an idea that the author, Mark Twain, will take up in his own works in the future, but it also projects the idea of white victimhood, something Americans today need to understand to fully comprehend what happened on January 6th. I'll return to this letter in a second, but for now, reason number two. Because of this personal growth and his status as an insider, he gives us this inside perspective of victimhood. Twain understands and develops the different frames of white victimhood for readers more artfully than most writers, even today. There are a few exceptions. But I would argue this is because he was not only surrounded by these ideas in his youth, but he embodied a lot of them himself. His interest in understanding white people, how white supremacy and racism function in America under the veil of whiteness, makes him one of the earliest critical whiteness scholars. So let me return to that letter. And I don't know if you're in the room right now, but Anne Ryan is all over this presentation. In Anne Ryan's chapter, Mark Twain and the Mean and Magical Streets of New York, in her edited book, Cosmopolitan Twain, she addresses the aforementioned letter, noting that in Clemens's letters home, he repeatedly represents himself as a victim of the changing demographics of New York. But she notes that the wording of that particular letter that we have here deflects the racist intention of the language, making it more of a complicated personal and cultural performance. That's exactly it. But what is that performance and how is that performance constructed? This is exactly what Twain can teach us about white supremacy today, the performativity at the center of white victimhood. The deflection, the colorblind language, the tropes of individualism, meritocracy, innocence, and virtue that enable white victimhood to flourish. Even as a young man, Twain understands the performativity of victimology and uses this later on to slyly dismantle this ideology frame by frame, so readers cannot continue to deny their racist justifications. He agrees with them, he mirrors their thinking, much like Stephen Colbert, as you pointed out before. But then he takes their twisted logic a step further, lying it bare for readers to reflect on. In so many of his works, he delves into understanding white privilege and blindness, that bad faith that Robinson has made famous. But I would argue that Twain seems to have a particular focus on white victimhood in many of his works. From pieces like Huck Finn, Pudd'nhead Wilson, King Leopold's Soliloquy, to shorter pieces like Disgraceful Persecution of a Boy, and the one I'll deal with most today, The United States of Lyncherdom, Twain is still the author I turn to when trying to explain the psychology of white victimhood to my students. Twain connects the thread of these thought processes from the Reconstruction era to today. He shows us that in many ways, America still lives in the shadow of the Civil War, that the post-civil rights era has many commonalities with the Reconstruction era. He is the American because his upbringing and travels allowed him to understand and identify with so many different parts of America. From growing up in a slave state, part of a slave-owning family, to marrying into an abolitionist family, Twain is one of the few white writers equipped to give readers an inside look of these complex thought processes that still thrive today. In past years in my classroom, I used to center conversations on Twain and white victimhood around Charlottesville. But now these conversations have been updated to discuss the January 6th insurrection because Twain has actually commented on what he thinks about white mobs that do more than just threaten to lynch those that they see as a threat. He understands the thoughts and feelings of those that cling to white victimhood better than many Americans today, especially in an America that remains divided and rarely sees and understands how the other half of Americans live. All right, so the riots. Twain, victimhood, and the January 6th riots. If any of you have been stuck at home this summer like I have, you've probably caught some of the January 6th hearings. The spring 2021 semester was my first semester back teaching in person after COVID. With the insurrection fresh in my students' minds, it was the perfect time to introduce Twain and his writings that reveal the performativity of this white victimhood. At the time, the violent insurrection at the Capitol building captured the attention of people around the world as the news media scrambled to understand the driving force behind these actions. Reporting on the subject centered around the same theme, white victimhood. The Atlantic columnist David A. Graham covered how Marco Rubio's public statements on the riot painted the news media as the true villain and the rioters as victims in his article entitled, "The Insurrectionists Would Like You to Know That They're the Real Victims." Carrie Goldberg's article in Elle magazine, "The Link Between the Capitol Insurrectionists and Abusers," claims their false sense of victimhood as the main connection. Yahoo News reporter Caitlin Dickinson entitled her article, "Capitol Rioters See Ashli Babbitt as Martyr and Themselves as Innocent Patriots." And there are many, many other examples. While race isn't explicitly mentioned here, these headlines reveal a pattern all too familiar to critical race scholars, particularly those who specialize in critical whiteness studies. Donald Trump centered his campaign and presidency on white victimhood, relying on what sociologist Edward Johnson referred to as a demagoguery defined by a reliance on victimized, white, toxic masculinity. It's not surprising that his followers would see themselves as victims. These rioters claim the moral high ground. They see themselves as innocent victims fighting against a corrupt system. Although many of his supporters deny being racist, they express a colorblind ideology that minimizes the role of racism in the world today, embracing an institutional system that enables colorblind policies to perpetuate racial injustice. So what does this have to do with Twain? I'm not going to read Pat Finn's speech. I know many of you heard John Bird do an excellent reading of it before. David, you dealt with it as well. But we can think of Pat Finn as many people who subscribe to white victimhood today. They see themselves as victims of reverse discrimination, scared that changing American demographics may challenge white supremacy and the privilege it confers. And again, I refer to Anne Ryan here. She refers to this speech as a self-critique on Mark Twain's part, because it mirrors many of his early letters, again explaining why Twain can so brilliantly create these tropes, because he once believed them himself. And of course, Donald Trump himself is the ultimate victim for these other victims to rally around, because as he stated last month, he is obviously the most persecuted person in the history of our country, attacked unjustly by the media, just like King Leopold in Twain's King Leopold soliloquy. Fun fact, it's deleted now, but there used to be a Tumblr I could show my students where they could guess who said it, King Leopold or Donald Trump. That's how close his speech was to Mark Twain's piece here. It's very good. All right. While some may object or be confused about how race, particularly white victimhood, fits into the January 6th insurrection, one has to think about the organizers behind this movement. So far, the Proud Boys have been the only organization that's been brought up on charges connected to the insurrection. I like to think of the Proud Boys as the colorblind racists of the white supremacy movement. They are the perfect example of how far the far right has gone to distance themselves from the racist moniker and embrace the ideology of white victimhood instead, something more palatable to a modern audience. The Proud Boys do not hate other races. They frame themselves as the defender of white rights in a world that has swung too far left. The Proud Boys declare themselves to be many things: anti-democracy, anti-Islam, anti-women, but not racist. They tout people of color as their head members, as if that excludes them from exhibiting any racist tendencies. They purely grab onto white victimhood and do their best to divorce it from an old-fashioned racism of an organization like the KKK. As the Southern Poverty Law Center explains, established in the midst of the 2016 presidential election by Vice media co-founder Gavin McInnes, the Proud Boys are self-described Western chauvinists who adamantly deny any connection to the racist alt-right. They insist they are simply a fraternal group spreading an anti-political correctness and anti-white guilt agenda. They epitomize modern white supremacy by ironically denying that they're racist at all. And I'll show you what I mean by that. There has been, and this isn't new, this article was published, I believe, in 2000, a lot of studies about how the nature of white supremacy is changing. White supremacist groups today rely on the victimhood ideology to rebrand themselves and mainstream themselves, returning to that 19th century, early 20th century where the KKK was a part of popular culture. They too want to be a part of popular culture today. Sociologist Mitch Berber uses Holstein and Miller's social constructionist view of victimhood to argue that victimhood ideology should be understood as its own burgeoning movement. They rely on these 5 themes I have outlined below. White people are victims of discrimination, white people's rights are being revoked, white people are stigmatized for expressing white pride, psychology affected through the loss of self-esteem, and their number one fear, the elimination of the white race. Gavin McInnes, the founder of Proud Boys, talks extensively about how he's not racist, he's really just trying to protect white people as we become extinct, apparently. All right. I'm gonna skip a little bit of this for the sake of time, but I want to draw your eyes to the bottom 2 bullet points here. The most important thing to know about modern white supremacy is how they are trying to cast themselves. Contemporary white supremacists engage in a new racist discourse that is interpreted as managing impressions and constructing images. Basically, they are trying to rewrite the white supremacist movement. They are trying to create their own narrative. As it says here, a second set of convergences relates to the study of white supremacists as active constructors of multiple realities. This is what David was just speaking to, this cognitive fallacy that allows them to see a reality that isn't really real. They're trying to take control and change a narrative, very much like history was rewritten during the Reconstruction era. I can name so many works and do hours of close readings describing all the different times Twain shows these frames of white victimhood, but we don't have a time, so instead I'm going to focus on one piece for us, the United States of Lyncher. So sorry, I'm going to quickly move past. I know King Leopold's Soliloquy is my other favorite. There. So for my students, it wasn't enough that Twain reveals the origins of white victimhood thinking for us to identify and dismantle. They wanted more concrete solutions. That analysis wasn't brilliant enough, although I think it is. I'll return to that. For those of you that have read The United States of Lyncherdom, you know that Twain is responding to the 1901 Pierce City, Missouri lynching. His basic argument is that no man wants to do something violent like this, but is driven to do it in fear of public disapproval. In the quotes I have behind me, he's tongue-in-cheek, but his message is clear. It is the moral cowardice of white people that perpetuates racism and violence. As long as it's publicly approved of, men will participate. But what is, my students ask me, all right, so what do we do? How does Twain propose we solve this problem? It's not simply enough to point it out, right? In this piece, Twain does provide a solution, which we'll discuss. He argues that brave men, but not just brave physically, not just strong men, but morally brave men who are willing to confront their own people from the inside, those that are willing to risk social exclusion, are the heroes. If we follow this definition, it's not those who fight against injustice and receive public approval for doing it. It has to be those courageous Americans who can stand up to their own people, their own party, their own friends, and risk being ostracized. Twain is not talking about himself here. Shelley this morning actually said this, that Twain is the first person to admit he does not have this moral fortitude. As we can see, he did not choose to publish this work during his lifetime. It was published much later, right? So Twain is not talking about himself. While he attacks imperialism and many other important issues, he admits that he cannot publish this piece because it would cause him to lose popularity. The quote, "I shouldn't even have half a friend left down there," meaning the South. So the real question, and I'll let you guys consider the answer to this question because it gives me a little lump in my throat. But the real question is, do we have heroes like that today? Do we have people willing to speak out against their own party and risk losing funding, risk losing their jobs? If you watch the January 6th insurrection or the hearings that have been covering it, perhaps we do. The January 6th insurrection was performed by a mob of people who believe in a narrative of America that is driven by white victimhood, making them believe their actions are necessary. Now, the January 6th hearings have come along in attempts to rewrite the narrative of that day from a different viewpoint. Like I said, I'll leave it up to you guys to debate if we have the kind of heroes present today that Twain claims we need. But in conclusion, I am humbly very happy with my students being able to identify these different frames after reading Twain. If they can recognize white victimhood and confront it in their own circles, I consider that a success, and I don't know a better way to achieve that aim than to continue teaching Twain. Thank you.